It is 25 minutes past 10 in the morning on Friday, the 10th of July. My name is Boaz Shoshan, and here we are again with another market broadcast. Now, it does feel like it's been quite a while since we've done one of these actually, but here we are again, and I've got Sam Volkering on the air, our tech specialist. Now, on today's market broadcast, as it's been quite a while, we're just going to be discussing some of the market stories, some of the market news that we think is should be very valuable to investors going forward. Picking up some of the themes that we think are going to be, they're going to be much more exaggerated in the future, which is why you should be paying attention to them now. Now, Sam, we have actually discussed one of the themes that we're going to discuss on this broadcast before, but there's sort of a catalyst that you think is really going to bring it to the fore. Now, I'm referring to cybersecurity. This is something that we have discussed on this market broadcast in the past, where I think I was bringing it to the table with the idea that because everybody is working from home, or not everybody, but there are so many office workers who've taken their work home with them, and because their office computers are much more secured, as they've generally got tech specialists with running network computers rather than personal computers. When they take their work home with them onto their own, onto their PCs or onto their laptops, that creates a massive opportunity for hackers to go in and steal all of this, all the trade secrets that might be on there, all of the personal information that the office, the company you're working for might have. So I was posing that as one of the big sort of bullish catalysts that could be great for the cybersecurity sector, because there's so much information now that's at risk. There are going to be people going to cybersecurity firms in order to try and protect their companies now that everybody's working from home. Now, Sam, you think there's another twist to this. There's another way in which cybersecurity could be really brought to the fore and could become a big opportunity for investors, right?
Yeah, that's right. And good morning to everybody, and thanks for joining us again. We talked about this the other day around the sort of threat levels and security around sort of personal networks, but it's looking increasingly likely that the UK is going to move away from using Huawei, the Chinese technology company, for UK's 5G networks. And that's not going to go down well in China, you would expect. And so I've sort of been saying that if that's to happen, I would think there'd be some blowback from China in terms of what they might call testing, but the rest of the world would probably call attacks on whatever is the infrastructure that the UK puts in place. I think, we know that the PLA have hundreds of thousands of people working in their cyber divisions for one reason or another. And I think we might have covered it again the other week when Australia underwent a massive cyber attack on all national government services. And that was believed to, again, have been from China as a retaliation to Australia's sort of pushback on everything from travel and tourism to the trade deals that are happening, or the trade talks with the US and the tensions that exist in there. So, you're seeing this increasing geopolitical tensions escalate, not necessarily in terms of physical warfare, but I think in terms of cyber warfare. And I believe that if the UK do move, which again is looking increasingly likely, away from Huawei and move to, whether it be Ericsson, Nokia, or another provider for a lot of the hardware, that's going to be very thoroughly given a shakedown by China and the powers that be within that. And so, what I'm saying and what I've been saying is that whether it's the US or Australia or pretty much the Five Eyes nations that are rolling out 5G networks, these are going to have the most top-notch level security in terms of whether or not they can be penetrated, what they connect to, what kind of infrastructure they connect to, how does that link in with, reliability, how does that link in with access to data and information for critical services? And people sort of start to think, well, what really has 5G got to do, with critical services or utilities and things like that? And I think a good example that sort of helps put 5G technology in the frame of those sorts of things is, so Ford recently signed a deal with Vodafone. So Ford have a battery manufacturing plant in Essex, and they recently rolled out a private 5G network, which they did in conjunction with Vodafone. And you kind of think, well, why does Ford need a 5G network at a battery facility? And the fact is that when they manufacture a battery at that facility, the process of doing that goes through, thousands of different, iterations. Now, like, for instance, there's apparently thousands of welds that go into making the battery that's needed for their electric vehicles. And they say that the data that creates and that they capture and use for their efficiencies and effectiveness of their processes, it's like up there in terms of millions of bytes of data a minute. And that the old networks that they've used, their old Wi-Fi networks, are just not capable of meeting that kind of data demand. And so they've installed a 5G network to enable that data to go from the Ford factory to wherever it needs to go with the kind of speed and precision and volume that's needed for them to be effective manufacturers of these batteries going forward. So, most people, when they think of 5G networks, think of, their phone and how fast they can download a movie or something like that. Or when they're video calling somebody, it might be a slightly less lag. But when you actually roll that out into industry and things like manufacturing, that sort of low latency is critical now in order to make sure that processes and manufacturing facilities are operating at full capacity and full efficiency, and that when they're not, they know what's going wrong and they know it in real time. So, protecting those sorts of assets and networks, I think, is going to be critical over the next few years as this all sort of rolls out.
Right. I mean, when you're thinking of 5G, and it really just is the infrastructure for the next evolution of the internet. And there's always that saying with, the future is already here. It just isn't evenly distributed. So in this case, Ford is using this in order to be able to, send huge amounts of data around at hyper fast speeds, and that is going to be rolled out and pushed out and much more developed all across the developed world. So it will be evenly distributed to some degree later on. But when you're talking about securing the basic infrastructure, it does feel like something that something's going to have to be done. But I think people are going to become much more aware of that in the future. Like everyone so far, well, I say everyone. So far there've been, whenever people talk about cyber attacks, it's almost always related in some way, or it's often blamed upon the Russians. That was always something that post 2016 everyone was really keen on saying, blaming everything on the Russians and saying some Russian hacker or Russian troll farm.
Yeah.
And it's not to say that certainly there are. I'm sure that does happen, and we also get the interesting case of in North Korea, where you get these sort of it's almost entrepreneurial, where there's the hackers are allowed to keep, I think, 10% above everything that they manage to steal online over $100,000. So if you want to keep your job, you need to steal $100,000 online some way or another, but you actually get to keep sort of a commission of 10% of everything that you steal on top of that. For the North Korean government, and so there are all these interesting tales and places. But something that I've always seen that people always don't refer to, or they don't look to as a really serious threat, is the Chinese Communist Party. So as you say, it was in 2014, FBI director says China has 270 to 300,000 people working in the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, on cyber espionage. And 50 to 60,000 more in other agencies of the CCP that are working on similar things when it comes to industrial espionage and the like, all through the internet. And that's 300,000 people. 200, or use the lower estimate, 270,000 people.
Yeah.
That is more people than how many towns and cities in the UK. Can you just imagine?
A great comparison that we always like to use back in Australia is that the MCG, the Melbourne Cricket Ground, could hold 100,000 people. So it's like three full MCGs working on cyber espionage, which is if you've ever been to the MCG where it's been 100,000 people, that is insane how many people working and pulling towards one goal. That is, and Amazon employs like 850,000 people. And okay, it's not that much, but it starts to give you a scale of just how many people are working.
Yeah. And it feels like when the CCP really does want to start becoming, sort of amping up the Cold War, the second Cold War, amping up or getting a bit hotter in cyberspace, that this would be something that would be directed at, their adversaries. So I suppose Australia, it does look like Australia has become a target of that after the Huawei sort of debacle. And now it seems inevitable also that it's going to get pointed at some way in the UK. What sort of angle would you expect that to come from? I mean, what do you think that would look like if the CCP did, mount a full-scale digital attack on the UK?
Well, see, a lot of people sort of ask me this question and they go, well, if China just wants to attack and take down the digital services of, a country, they'll just do it. And there's, nothing that can be done about it. I'm like, well, that's not necessarily the case. You can still have, hundreds of thousands of people working towards, cyber espionage or cyber attacks or things like that, and still have them be ineffective. And that comes down to, if they're the bowler, and they're trying to take out your wickets, how effective is your batting defense? And sometimes you'll, also play a wonderful cover drive down for, for four. So if the UK's batting facing China's bowling in this sort of thing, then you really got to appreciate the capabilities that that the government here can pull on, whether that be predominantly comes from, I guess, private industry or publicly listed companies that have the people and the resources and the human intelligence to fight back or to defend effectively or to put measures in place, so that you can still throw some of the most sophisticated cyber attacks at these critical infrastructure and resources and things like that, and them be ineffective. Now, if you don't have those measures in place, if you stand well off leg stump and just let the bowler have full attack at it, then you're going to get clean bowled. So I think people are naive to just how much is already flowing into cybersecurity and cyber defense. And I think they really underestimate that as we continue to progress through even more hyper-connected technologies, as everything connects, as cities become smart cities, as we talk about connected cars and mesh networks for automated mobility, whether that be cars or small devices or automated delivery services, all these sorts of things. As we continue to make the world more connected with lower latency and more reliable on those sorts of data flows in order to make things work the way that they should in this automated sort of world that we were sort of progressing towards, the need to ensure that all of that stays online or up, so to speak, so that the uptime on that continues to be high, there's no downtime, and that the latency on that isn't slowed down as well. So you've also got to consider that an attack might not be necessarily to take down a network, but to clog it up and to slow it down. Because if you can do that, then all of a sudden, all those new systems that we're looking to roll out into cities and urban areas, they don't work the way they should and they become ineffective. And that has a drag on productivity, that has a drag on economic output. So there's, you start to see the ripple effects from different kinds of attacks on these sorts of networks. And you start to see, okay, well, maybe this is far more serious than we consider. And, there's sort of two sides to the coin. Is the sort of public perception and investment perception that, cybersecurity is just one of those things that, no one really takes seriously because a lot of investors don't. But then there's so much interest and so much awareness in companies that, that run data centers or, have an app-based business, that know that without the right kinds of protection and security on their networks, their systems, how they transfer and flow data from a user to their data center or back to some other connected service, without that kind of protection and the spending that needs to go into that, then they're just they, like I said, they're standing off a leg stump and just letting them have free reign at the wicket. So there is I think huge opportunity long term and short term, really, as the world starts to wake up, that when we roll out these hyper-connected, low-latency networks, and we connect more and more things, and our cities become smart, and our homes become smarter, relatively smarter, that there's going to be a number of opportunities in the stocks that are helping to protect those networks and services. And I think people will start to wake up a bit more to it now, because the networks are coming and they're here, whereas maybe in a 2G or 3G world, it wasn't necessarily as important to protect those networks because we weren't as reliant on them. But now that we are, they are critical infrastructure, and they're critical to day-to-day operation of a lot of businesses, a lot of lives, a lot of economies. And so to protect that, I think, is a huge opportunity, and certainly one of the bigger investment stories I think we're going to see over the next sort of 10 years.
Now, when I'm thinking of the cybersecurity space in general, when I'm looking at how investors are taking a look at that space, how they're valuing that space, I look to an ETF. Well, it's a passive ETF, so it is an ETF which simply tracks an underlying index, but it is the Pure Funds ISE Cybersecurity ETF, which has the very witty ticker of HACK. So if you ever just look for the HACK ETF with the $ behind the HACK, you should be able to find it pretty easily. Now, just in terms of how that's performed since the March crash, at the time of us broadcasting this, it is looking like it's up more than 50% since that point, and it's now actually reached all-time highs. So it is now higher than it has ever been before. So there's clearly a lot of money that is going into this space, either from the investment or maybe some of the more speculative side. We have seen internet stocks perform incredibly well following the March crash. And I guess this is a form of internet stock, but it's sort of a more defensive form of internet stock, right, Sam?
Yeah, I mean, the ETF is certainly sort of, I guess, one part of getting an assessment of where things are at in that space. I think another thing to probably look at is also some of the bigger cybersecurity stocks, and you find a number of those, obviously, in the US markets. So, I mean, what I'd probably look at, you look at a stock like FireEye, perhaps, or CyberArk Security. Again, these are sort of two of the more known players in that space. Whereas, so you look at something like Hack, and you look at the kinds of companies that make up the weighting of that. They've got a few pure plays in there. So there's like Fortinet, Cloudflare, but then also they got like Cisco Systems and Akamai. Again, these are cybersecurity companies, but they're not necessarily all about cybersecurity as well. So it does give you a good weighting in that sense. They've got a bit of a spread, but I think the industry presents opportunities in more individual sorts of plays. And we know that, when you look at, some of these companies, I said like FireEye, Fortinet, CyberArk, that they're not necessarily at the sorts of points where they had been prior to the sort of market crash. And I think that presents opportunities. I think that presents opportunities in the right ones that are doing the right things, that are involved in the right sorts of cybersecurity, ones that have got a focus on certainly networking, connected networks like 5G rollouts and that sort of thing. That's where I think we're going to start to see some of the bigger leaps and bounds. I know, like, for instance, if we look at a stock like CyberArk, it had a decent run from sort of 2017 through to 2019, and then the market crash, and it's still some way off from its all-time highs. Again, Proof Point's another one. These are predominantly US-based stocks, but they're all really sort of hunting around that same space, and they've done okay in history. And I think when you go back through the last sort of 5 years on a lot of these sorts of companies, they've done okay. And when you push the boat out a little bit as longer term, I think opportunities, that's when these sorts of stocks start to really come into their own. And I think that's the story here as well, is that I think that it's going to be a longer term play, because these aren't necessarily the kinds of investments that sort of just explode, because they don't necessarily have, it's not one of those industries that has necessarily that same sort of explosive nature that you would get from I don't know, something that's,
Social
just
media.
cracked, proper, home grade, commercial, consumer grade quantum computing, right? Or a biotech that announces they've got successful results. You can see the sort of explosiveness that comes in a day for those sorts of things. But with cybersecurity and cyber defense, it's critical to the world that we operate in. But at the same time, it's not like they put out an announcement that says we stopped the Chinese hack and their stock shoots up 100% in a day. It's just not really how these sorts of companies operate. And so investors then sort of, I think, fall away from this as an investment class in that respect, because they kind of look for the short-termism that you get in the markets right now, because it is volatile and you get, really big swings in a lot of other industries and opportunities, which is perfectly fine. But you've also got to balance out, when you're looking at building a portfolio and building wealth long-term, you've got to balance out that long-term game. And if I think about the kinds of industries that have got longevity over any sorts of other industries, I can't see how you can look past cybersecurity and cyber defense, network security, network defense, all these sorts of protection of our connected world. I don't see how you can look past that as a great long-term story, because it's not like we're going to wind back all these technologies. It's not like we're going to go from 5G to 4G technology. After 5G will be 6G and 7G and 8G. Whether we still call them G or whatever, I don't know. But there is going to be upgrades and improvements and evolutions and revolutions in these sorts of technologies. So it's only going to increase. We don't regress when it comes to technology and technological advancement. And so it is ever increasingly important to make sure that that's all protected. And so when I think about the kinds of industry that I would want to have an exposure to long term, it's cybersecurity just keeps coming back to the fore because of the world that we're building out and the world that we live in. And I think that's the kind of mindset that investors need to take when they look at the kinds of opportunities in this space.
Yeah, I look at that ETF more simply as a proxy for the space in general. But as you describe, it is it's very unique stock, I think, is the cybersecurity space, because it has some of the glamour, I suppose, that is associated with the internet stock phenomenon in general. But as you describe, it's not like a social media company going public after they've built a gigantic network and they're getting all of this engagement. It's not like, as you describe, a biotech stock that's come up with a cure for anything, and they can't brag about their achievements in fending off massive cyber attacks, or at least they can't do so in a way that is really all that glamorous outside of an investment prospectus, but it still has that internet side to it. And of course, as you described, the internet is not going to be going away anytime soon. So, and as they get a huge amount of money from government agencies and large companies who are needing that cyber defense, I see it almost like the defense contractors, I suppose, of the internet space. But they still have that glitz and glamour, and in some ways low capital costs when it comes to the actual amount of things that they need to build and buy. It still has that low asset sort of level that is associated with the internet. It's not like a defense contractor which needs to have actual gigantic factories churning out military grade gear, but it still has that defense sort of angle to it, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, cyber stocks aren't sexy. Even with defense stocks, some of these companies, they make missiles and planes and stuff. I mean, that's Top Gun, man. That's sexy stuff.
Right.
But cybersecurity is like a bunch of nerds behind a computer in hoodies with like Matrix style wallpapers on their screens. That's not. Investors don't get super excited about that stuff, but they should. They should. This is and I think that's where sometimes people fall down. The smart money sees it and sees it and recognizes it for what it is. But I think a lot of investors just miss the trick because it's just not sexy. There's other more more riveting, exciting things that will capture your attention. But when you look at a long-term smart investment, I think that you really can't, as unsexy as cybersecurity might be for an investor, you've got to really look at it and just, when you think about the world that we're building out and the importance of, a cyber security company for these sorts of networks is equally as important as the semiconductor company that helps to make the networks exist in the first place. They do not mutually exist of each other. They are codependent. One does not exist without the other, and yet all the attention, all the excitement goes towards the semiconductor companies and the companies building out that sort of hardware side of it. But without the defense and the security side of it, it just doesn't work. It doesn't exist. It's slow, it's buggy, it's laggy, and it doesn't work the way it should be. So I think if you want to play that kind of the progress of the world and the technology progress of the world, if you want to play it the right way, you play both sides of that argument.
Right. I think you probably best sum that up with this isn't sexy, but you should be excited about it. I think that works as a pretty good label for this space. I think we'll wrap that up for today's market broadcast, Sam. But do you have any closing comments on that? We have focused quite specifically on this topic, but there is an awful lot of juice in it.
Yeah, I think it's easy to sort of hear the term cybersecurity and just think of something like that crappy software that you put on your Windows PC that just makes it crash all the time and brings up the blue screen of death.
Right.
The consumer experience with cybersecurity is either poor or non-existent, basically. Yet in the background, it's fundamental to the operation of the world that we live in today and that we're going to live in tomorrow. So I think it's hard as well for people to shake the idea of what they are used to in terms of their experience with this, as opposed to what actually happens in this space. Which is why I think it's really important that investors get a better understanding of the wider space and its importance to the world that we live in today and tomorrow. And then when you start to get a good understanding of how it all sort of pieces together, that's when you start to really see how big an opportunity I think this presents.
Very good. That was Sam Volkering here at Southbank Research. We probably will be revisiting this theme a few times in the future, especially if we're right about the rise of cyber attacks now that a lot of the Western developed countries are turning on China to some degree. That is all we have for this week. We shall be back again with another market broadcast next week. In the meantime, I hope you have a very good weekend, and we'll see you in the next one.